So today it's a deep dive into esophageal squamous papilloma. Our goal, like always, is to pull out the key stuff from the source text. We have this excerpt about the condition and just make sense of it for you.
Mm.
What is it? Who gets it? Why does it even matter? We're aiming to turn this potentially, well, dense medical info into something clear and understandable.
Okay, let's do it. So first things first, what is this thing? The material we're looking at calls it a benign esophageal epithelial polyp.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. Benign means not cancerous, right?
Correct, non-cancerous.
Esophageal in the esophagus, the tube from your mouth down to your stomach.
Yep.
And polyp is just like a growth, a little lump.
Pretty much, yeah. A growth. And the squamous epithelial part. That just means it's made of the type of cells that normally line the esophagus. Squamous cells.
So it's like a little overgrowth of a normal lining, but it's not cancer.
Exactly. And it grows in a specific way. The source mentions a papillary growth pattern.
Papillary, what does that look like?
Think of tiny little finger-like projections, almost frond-like. That gives it that characteristic bumpy, maybe even a bit wart-like surface they describe.
Oh, okay, like little fingers sticking out.
Yeah. And the source notes it's officially recognized. It has its ICD codes and stuff, so it's a known thing in medicine.
Got it. And there was something about a related type.
Oh, right. There's a variation called squamous cell papillomatosis. That's where someone has multiple papillomas, not just the one. It's less common, though.
Okay, so we know what it is, this benign finger-like growth. Where does it actually pop up in the esophagus? The source seemed to have some interesting details on that.
Yeah, this was quite striking. It seems location can vary quite a bit geographically. So in one big study from the U.S., they found it most often way down low, in the lower esophagus.
Near the stomach.
Exactly. Which kind of makes you think about reflux, maybe irritation from stomach acid.
Makes sense if irritation is involved.
Right. But then you look at studies from places like Taiwan, and it's actually more common in the middle part of the esophagus.
Wow, really? So it depends where the study was done. That's interesting.
It is, yeah. Quite a difference.
So if a doctor's doing an endoscopy, putting a camera down there, what would they actually see? What's it look like?
Well, the description's pretty clear. It's typically this small, whitish growth, and it sticks out from the esophageal wall. They call that exophytic.
Sticks out, okay.
And it often has that wart-like surface we mentioned, and you can usually see tiny blood vessels crossing over it.
Like a little white wart inside. How big are we talking?
Usually quite small. The source mentions a median size of just 3 millimeters. Yeah, really small typically, although it does say giant ones have been reported, which sounds, well, a bit more dramatic.
Yeah, giant polyps sounds less fun. Okay, so that paints a good picture. Now, how common is this, and who tends to get it? The epidemiology stuff.
Right. Well, the first thing the material stresses is that it's pretty uncommon.
Okay.
Prevalence in people getting endoscopies is low, somewhere between like 0.01% and maybe 0.45%. So, yeah, definitely not something seen every day.
Very low numbers. Any difference between men and women?
Yeah. And this is another area where the data seems a bit mixed, depending on the study. One French study found it slightly more often in men. But then a lot of other studies, particularly from other regions, actually report it being more common in women.
Huh. So no single clear answer on that based on this source?
Doesn't seem like it, no. The ratio varies.
And age. Who usually gets this?
Typically presents in middle age. The median age mentioned is around 50. That related condition, papillomatosis, the one with multiple growths, they can apparently show up in kids or older folks too.
Yeah.
But for the single papilloma, middle age seems typical. And just to emphasize how rare it is, the source notes only about 30 or so cases have actually been reported in the English medical literature.
Wow, only 30 reported cases. That really is uncommon. Okay, now for the really interesting part for me, why does this happen? What causes it? The source listed quite a few possibilities.
Yeah, this is where it gets complex. One major factor seems to be chronic irritation of the esophageal lining.
Irritation? Like what?
Well, it could be chemical irritation. Think gastroesophageal reflux, stomach acid splashing back up. That fits with finding them lower down sometimes.
Right.
Alcohol and smoking are also mentioned as chemical irritants, even things like caustic injury, swallowing something damaging.
Okay, chemical stuff. What else?
Then there's mechanical irritation, just sort of physical rubbing or minor trauma. This could be from certain medical procedures like injections for varices or having stents placed, even things like food getting stuck, or irritation from intubation tubes or esophageal dilation.
So basically anything that repeatedly bothers the lining, chemically or physically.
Seems to be a big part of it, yeah. But then there's something else the material brings up that feels, well, a bit unexpected. HPV.
Human papillomavirus. Really? In the esophagus?
Yes. This was quite surprising to read. The source states that HPV infection is actually found pretty frequently in these papillomas. Some studies found HPV in the tissue in, up to 87.5% of cases.
Whoa, almost 90% in some series. I usually associate HPV with, other areas. Is that common knowledge for esophageal issues?
It's definitely a significant finding highlighted here. It suggests that, yes, irritation plays a role, but this viral link seems, surprisingly common according to these data points.
Yeah, that's definitely not something I would have guessed. Wow. Any other potential causes mentioned? Rarer ones?
Right, there are a couple of very rare associations mentioned with specific genetic syndromes.
Okay.
Things like focal dermal hypoplasia, which is also called Goltz-Gorlin syndrome, and another one called angioma serpiginosum. These are described as rare genetic conditions linked to the X chromosome.
Okay, so that's way less common than irritation or even the HPV link sounds.
Absolutely. So you've got this mix, common irritants, this fairly frequent viral connection, and then these extremely rare genetic links. Quite a range.
It really is. So how do these different things, the irritation, the virus, the genetics, actually make the papilloma grow? What's the mechanism?
The pathogenesis, yeah. The source describes it as basically pretty straightforward. Whether it's the chronic irritation or maybe the HPV infection, something injures the lining cells.
Okay.
And the body responds by trying to heal and regenerate. But it sort of overdoes it. You get this hyperregenerative response. The cells proliferate too much, and they form that overgrown, finger-like papillary structure.
So the body's repair process goes a bit haywire and builds too much tissue.
That's the idea presented, yeah. And interestingly, the source suggests that even in those rare genetic syndromes, the papillomas might be linked to the fact that those patients often have really significant reflux starting from a young age. So irritation might still be the trigger there, too.
Huh. Fascinating. It's like different roads leading to the same overenthusiastic repair job. Okay, so if they take a biopsy, what's it look like under the microscope, and how do doctors tell it apart from other things?
Microscopically, the material describes what you'd expect. That papillary structure, those finger-like bits made of the squamous lining cells.
Right.
And inside those fingers, there's a core of connective tissue and tiny blood vessels, the fibrovascular core. They also mentioned seeing some scattered cells that look a bit vacuolated or empty, resembling coilocytes.
Coilocytes, aren't those often linked to HPV?
They are, yeah. So that can be another clue under the microscope suggesting the HPV connection might be there.
Interesting.
But, crucially, the source points out that you don't typically see dangerous signs. Things like atypical nuclear features, weird-looking cell nuclei that might suggest cancer, or specific viral inclusions aren't usually present.
Okay, so it looks abnormal, but not usually cancerous under the microscope.
Exactly. The growth pattern might vary a bit, sticking out, growing inward, looking spiked. And while dysplasia, which is like a precancerous change, has apparently been reported very rarely in association with these, it's definitely not the norm.
So, mostly benign looking at the cellular level. How do they make sure it isn't something more serious or something else entirely?
Good question. The source mentions distinguishing it from a few things. One is a fibrovascular polyp.
Okay, how's that different?
Well, those are typically found higher up in the esophagus, and while they're covered in similar cells, they don't have that distinct papillary finger-like growth pattern. It's a different shape and often different location.
Gotcha. Different structure, different spot.
Right. And then the most critical distinction, obviously, is differentiating it from actual squamous cell carcinoma esophageal cancer.
Yeah, that's the big one.
And the source is very clear. The key is to rule out invasion. Doctors have to look closely to make sure the abnormal cells haven't broken through the base layer and started invading deeper tissues. That's the defining feature of cancer here.
So checking for invasion is absolutely crucial.
The absolute key, yes. The material also adds that simpler tests like cytology, just looking at scraped cells, or advanced molecular tests aren't generally needed or considered relevant for diagnosing this specific thing. It really comes down to the visual look during endoscopy and the microscopic examination of the tissue, focusing on structure and invasion.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's talk outcome. Someone gets diagnosed with this, it's removed. What happens next? What's the prognosis like?
The good news, according to the source, is that once it's resected or removed, it doesn't recur.
Oh, that's great. So removal is curative, basically.
Dudes like it, yeah.
Now, we touched on the cancer link when talking about telling it apart. Does the source say anything more about an association?
Yes, And it's important to get the wording right, just as the source presents it. It says that squamous cell carcinoma has been rarely reported to be associated with squamous papilloma, or the multiple form, papillomatosis.
Okay, rarely associated. So it's not like this thing commonly turns into cancer?
Correct. It's not described as a typical precancerous lesion that progresses, but a rare link or association has been observed and documented in the medical literature. It's something doctors are aware of, even if it's uncommon.
Okay, that's a really important clarification from the source rare association, not a direct pathway usually. All right, let's try and pull this all together for you, our listener. We took a deep dive today into esophageal squamous papilloma. We learned it's generally this uncommon, benign growth in the esophagus, often small, whitish, with that kind of finger-like or wart-like surface.
Yeah, and we saw its location can actually differ depending on the population studied lower down in the U.S. series, more mid-esophagus in the Taiwanese data. And it's rare overall, typically seen in middle-aged people, though the gender split seems a bit variable in the reports.
And the cause is quite a mix presented in the material, ranging from, common stuff like reflux, smoking, alcohol, physical irritation from procedures.
Right through to that surprisingly common link with HPV infection, found in many cases, according to some studies, and even connections to extremely rare genetic syndromes.
We also touched on what it looks like microscopically, those papillary structures, maybe some HPV-related cell changes, but crucially, usually without signs of cancer or invasion.
And how doctors tell it apart from other things, especially the need to definitively rule out invasive cancer.
And finally, the prognosis is generally good. The source states it doesn't come back after removal. And while a rare association with cancer has been noted, it's not considered a common precursor lesion.
Exactly. It's really a good example of how focusing on a specific source, even for a condition that seems a bit obscure, can yield some really nuanced and, frankly, unexpected insights.
Definitely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, based on all this. When you consider the sheer variety of potential factors linked in the source to this one specific condition, you've got mechanical rubbing, chemical burns from reflux, a virus like HPV, and these incredibly rare genetic things. What does that diversity tell us?
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it? What does it suggest about how complex our body's responses are? How different triggers, internal and external, sometimes completely unrelated seeming things, can potentially converge and lead to the same specific outcome like this papilloma? It really highlights the intricate and sometimes unpredictable ways our bodies react to the world around or within them. Something to chew on.